Hello, distinguished guests! My name is Shannon, and this week, after what feels like forever, I am finally constructing my 1890s athletic corset, and I am stoked. This has been a long time coming, so let's jump right in. If you are here because you want to make an athletic corset of your own, and you are hoping I will be using a purchased pattern that you can acquire and then follow along, I'm sorry to disappoint, but I arrived at this pattern by taking my 1890s fashion corset and going through a series of mock-ups and alterations. I have an entire video on that process if this is the approach that you too want to take. Otherwise, I can recommend a few different options. I have heard that Isabel Pryor of Pryor Attire will have an athletic corset pattern coming out in her new book this spring. And there are a couple online options as well, which I will link below, including an article by Kat Simpson that was originally written for Foundations Revealed, but is now available to the general public. Coming in a strong first on my recommendations list, however, are a few different options from Corset Cutting and Making, the Revised Edition, by clothing historian and researcher Marian McNeely. The book contains two athletic corset patterns, one from 1902 and one from roughly 1919, as well as an equestrian corset from the early 1900s and several different waist patterns. In this context, waist refers to the undergarment often worn by children and young ladies that was essentially a corded corset but with less shaping, and there are 3 waist patterns in this book that can be easily modified to look like the corset I'm about to make. If you don't want to purchase a physical book, it's also available on Kindle Cloud Reader, which is how I read it, and if you just want the patterns, or if you don't want to have to draft them out of the book and would prefer to print a full-scale version, Marian has a couple different sets of corset patterns available on her Etsy store, and the various athletic corsets I mentioned are all available there. I'll put the link to her store down in the description. Marian also has a couple athletic corsets in her private collection, including a Ferris Good Sense waist, which is what I'm modeling my athletic corset after, and she was generous enough to spend a couple hours with me on Zoom, giving me a very detailed look at them, including measurements and details of the various materials used, which was super helpful in the process of constructing this corset. A good look at an extant example shows that this corset was 2 layers thick, with what looked like a white cotton herringbone on the outside and either a large weave cotton or linen on the inside. However, as Marian noted, while the outer fabric visually resembles today's coutil, it is much lighter and thinner. Holding her corset up to the light, I could easily see the light pass through both layers of the fabric, and it was incredibly soft and pliable. So if it was coutil, it probably had the sizing taken out of it. And so, as I said about my plans for making my corset, I decided to give myself options. Being still in lockdown over here, I had to order fabric online from a Danish store. I thought I ordered 100% cotton herringbone weave, but apparently I mistranslated because it is only a twill. Nevertheless, it is quite lightweight at only 240 grams per square meter. I also decided to throw my leftover coutil in the washing machine to see how much it would soften up. This was a fairly sturdy coutil to begin with, and while the washing softened it up a little bit, it was still much stiffer than the twill, and it didn't resemble the original garment as much, so cotton twill it shall be. This will also be used to make the edge binding, while for the lining layer I'll be using this white cotton fabric from my stash. While buttons are not something usually associated with corsets, they play a large role in this corset, and so I needed to source the proper ones. The original corset uses 7 buttons on the front, each button having 2 very large holes to accommodate a thin twill tape. I tried to buy some similar buttons online because, again, COVID, but when they arrived they were aesthetic but thin, flimsy, made of wood, and would almost certainly break if I tried to use them as the main closure on a garment. So there was a small moment of panic, but fortunately the CosTube community came to my rescue, and Marion, or Green Martha as she's known here, mailed me some of hers.
Merci beaucoup, Marion. Tu m'as sauvé la vie. Woo! Arrivé!
The original Ferris waist used buttons that were roughly a ½ inch in diameter, and mine are almost identical, although the holes are a bit smaller, so instead of twill tape, I will be using some thin cording. If you are searching for your own buttons, I recommend using the search term antique underwear buttons or lingerie buttons. I went over my my elastic decisions a bit in my mock-up video, but instead of using short elastic strips, as seen in the Ferris cycling waists, I decided to go with a solid elastic strip, imitating the 1902 athletic corset from Marion's book. And so I got my hands on some power net from Vina Cava. Although if you're located in North America, tutu.com is a good alternative for this material. I won't be needing much of this, so it will certainly be saved for future projects. This corset, unlike many, will be light on the boning and heavier on the cording, which is good because, in my opinion, the less plastic in the environment, the better. In the original Ferris waists, the boning behind the buttons and next to the grommets on the center back were a ½ inch wide, while the side bones were closer to a 1/4 inch. The originals are steel bones, but they are incredibly flexible. A side-by-side comparison by Marion revealed that plastic whalebone would be a very comparable material today. So, to mimic this boning as closely as I can, I'll be using 12mm plastic whalebone for the center, front, and back, and 6mm bones for the sides. Even though there aren't many bones, there are still loads of cording helping to maintain a vertical rigidity to the garment. Most of the cording is absolutely tiny. Each cording channel, including the width of the fabric and the cording, is 2mm total, so I'll be using this 1mm cotton cording for as much of the garment as possible. Unless I run out, then I will supplement with this 2mm cotton cording that I will also be using for the button strip in the front. For the lacing eyelets, I will be using size 00 grommets. I have set literally thousands of grommets in my life, and I've never had trouble with these 2-part grommets from C.S. Osborne. The flange on these is a bit thicker than on the extant version, but I already own a zillion of them and I trust them to work, so I'm not about to let historical accuracy get in the way of sheer practicality, says the girl replicating a centuries-old corset to perform circus tricks in. The first part of this garment that I wanted to make was the buttonhole strip in the center front, not only because I was excited to try a new technique, following the patent for this method, but also because it was the only part that needed to be vertically precise. The rest of the corset could have slight adjustments made to the final height by means of a scissors, but this panel needed to be carefully split up so that the correct number of buttons fit evenly in the allotted height. To streamline this video, I'll break that process down further in a separate video, where I show how I built my own button strip. But basically, I will construct a long strip of fabric with cording reinforcement along the edges, which I'll then cut up into smaller pieces and reassemble to form a sort of button panel. Keep an eye out for that video, with a detailed look at the patented Ferris method of working buttonholes. Or you could just subscribe and hit the notification bell to let YouTube do that work for you. The next thing to tackle before I could really start assembling this corset was the issue of cording. I already had my cording chosen, but apart from that buttonhole strip, I had never actually sewn any cording, and as I mentioned, I don't have a cording foot. I don't even have a zipper foot. So I decided to try a couple different methods to see which one would work best for me. First, I tried marking and sewing the channels down ahead of time and then threading the cord through after the fact. Then I tried sewing the small cording by sandwiching it in the fabric and sewing over the cording with a large dull needle to help keep that cord pressed in the right position. I decided that for this smaller cording, the first method worked better, so keeping that in mind, I next had to think about the correct order of operations and when in the process of assembling the corset to insert the cording. Once I really broke it down, however, it became clear that there was kind of only one option, because the Ferris waists used almost exclusively double welted seams. A welt seam, most commonly seen today on your jeans, is essentially a stitch that has the seam allowances ironed to one side and then 2 parallel lines of top stitching to secure the seam allowances down. While it is a fairly straightforward method of constructing a corset, and one I wanted to use in order to replicate the original, it also meant that I couldn't sew the cording channels in before attaching the panels together, because the welt seam method requires the outermost layers to be sewn on with good sides to the interior, sandwiching the layers of the previous panel in the middle. So by necessity, they can't already be attached together with a cording channel. This meant that I would need to go one section at a time, first attaching 2 panels together with the welt seam, then adding the cording, before proceeding to the next panel and then that panel's cording channels. With the order of operations nailed down, it was time to move on to the fun part, the assembly.
The first step, after having prepped my fabric, because remember these were meant to be washable, was to cut out the pieces. In the original Ferris waist, the herringbone pattern runs horizontally and parallel to the waistline throughout the whole garment. As I unfortunately don't have a herringbone pattern though, this is a moot point and I was free to align my piece however I pleased. In order to keep the grain square and consistent through all the panels, I referenced the straight edges of the panel pieces off of the selvage, keeping the grain line of the pieces perfectly parallel to this edge throughout the entire layout process. The exact placement of the grain is less essential for this corset than for a fashion corset that has larger curves and does more silhouette shaping, but it's a good general practice and doesn't require much extra work. Alright guys, I thought I would pop in here to give you a quick update on how things are going, especially because I just did something that I think might bear a bit of extra explanation. So what I've been doing so far is just taking my pattern pieces and laying them all out on the fabric, making sure that the grain line is correct and adding in my 1 centimeter seam allowance. But what I have not been doing on purpose is I have not been adding any additional width for the cording channels that will be going on here. And normally when you are making a corset that has a lot of cording channels, you have to account for a little bit of extra width because cording channels naturally take up more space than flat fabric. And so you need to account for that extra space by giving it a little bit of extra fabric. However, because my cording is minuscule and there is not a lot of it on each individual panel, I do not think that this will cause very much distortion, especially when I went back and looked at the test piece that I did. This is not taking up a lot of additional width. So I have not added any additional width on these pattern pieces with the exception of one, and that is this piece right here. It is the one that goes on the center front right next to the button strip, and as you can see it is almost entirely made up of cording channels. There are 6 channels on this piece, and so that one might get a bit distorted if I don't take into account any extra fabric. So what I did was I laid it out on my fabric and I made some marks to keep it on the correct grain line. I marked off the approximate height of the piece, and then I gave it a lot of extra width. I'm going to give it way more width than I need to, and then I'm just going to cut this out as it is, sew the 6 cording channels in there, put the cords in them, and then I'm going to put the pattern piece back on top, mark out the precise lines of where the heights should be and the widths as well, and then I will cut it out. And that way I will guarantee that the cording channels don't completely throw off the shape of this pattern piece. So let's get back to it. Now that everything was all chalked out, with the proper seam allowances on the side, it could be cut out. To save a bit of time, I carefully placed my lining layer under the twill and cut out both at once. Again, in a corset where the fabric's grain plays a larger role, I might have cut these out separately, but I don't need to worry about that for this corset. Next, I laid all the pieces in order to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything and for ease of assembly. The first pieces to get attached were the button strip and the narrow strip that would have all of the cording. And here we can start to understand the double welt method of construction. The 2 pieces of the cording strip are aligned on either side of the button strip, forming a sandwich, and then are stitched together along the chalked line. Once they are attached, the 2 outermost pieces of fabric are then folded back, hiding the raw edges and exposing the lovely button strip. They are then ironed in this position to ensure crisp, clean edges, and then the seam allowances will be permanently secured with 2 lines of top stitching on either side of the welt. Next, the cording channels were sewn in, and then the cording was inserted with the use of a large, blunt tapestry needle. Originally, there were supposed to be 6 cords, but unfortunately, due to the lack of a zipper or cording foot for my machine, I made the channels too wide and only had room for 4. Once the cording was inserted and the piece ironed, I could lay out my pattern pieces, ensuring that everything was lined up with the middle button, and cut this panel down to its final size. The rest of the front panels were assembled in the same manner, first making a panel sandwich, being sure to take the time to properly align all my edges, then stitching the panels down, trimming up the seam allowances and cutting any necessary notches, turning the sandwich right side out, ironing the panels so they sit flat and behave, and then the 2 lines of top stitching on either side of the welt.
Now, it should be pointed out that notches are not always the best idea when assembling a corset. As Minji reminded me, it's preferable to trim your seam allowances short rather than notching them because it's better at preventing weak spots in your corset. In this case, however, the fabric of the seam allowances is actually adding vertical stiffness and structure, so I don't want to trim them down. And the double lines of top stitching should counteract any weakness that notches would add.
After the panels were joined with the welt seam, any cording and boning channels were added, following the color coding of my pattern pieces. This method continued throughout the entire front half of the corset until I hit the elastic panel. At this point, I could no longer do the welt seam method, so the edges of my fabric were ironed under, and then the elastic panel was removed from my mock-up in order to be reused in the final garment. To make my life a bit easier and the finished piece a bit cleaner, I first attached the elastic to the inside cotton fabric and then in a second pass sewed the cotton twill down. This might have taken a bit longer, but it was so much easier and cleaner that I would definitely recommend it. Next up were the 2 back panels, starting with center back. I had purposely left a large seam allowance so that my grommets would be secured through 4 layers of fabric rather than just 2, as these grommets tend to work best with a bit thicker material in my experience. This seam allowance was then turned to the inside and the whole piece ironed, and then it was time for grommets. First, I measured out the placement of my holes, then I did a quick test piece to make sure that these grommets worked well with this fabric, and then I moved on to the actual pieces, first punching the holes and then inserting the grommets. I know this part can seem daunting to some, but I absolutely love it. I find this step of the process so satisfying. Once I had the grommets inserted on one half, I used that half as a template to mark the placement for the second panel and then repeated the process. It all went quite smoothly, and it wasn't until the next step that I hit a bit of a snag. Alright, so we have come upon a slight hiccup, and it's not a massive game changer, but it is going to slow me down a little bit. I do have to go back and recut a couple things, so I thought I would bring it up to you guys here and say what the problem is and how exactly I'm going to solve it. And the main problem is that when I made these panel pieces, I made them with the assumption that I could put the grommets in that lovely montage that you just saw, and then I would be able to just throw my stitch lines down for my boning. I'm going to have one big wide 1/2 inch bone that goes here, and then my various cording channels next to it. However, what I have just discovered is that my sewing machine does not want to put a line of stitching down if it has part of its foot on the grommets. Now, this is not a problem I've ever had before. My previous machines have sewn over grommets. I mean, the foot has passed over grommets before without a problem. However, that machine is back in Montreal, and I am here. And I have a different machine, and I can't really complain because it was free. I pulled it out of the dumpster and it's working very well. However, it just does not like to sew when one of its feet is raised up significantly higher on these grommets, and I can't really blame it. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to go back and recut these panels and sew all of the cording and boning channels first, so all of the stitching is done, and then the very last step I will do will be to add the grommets, and that way I shouldn't have any problems with my machines. And while I am there, I've decided I'm actually going to make a slight modification to the pattern, because right now I have cut a fairly wide seam allowance here, but what I did not do was I did not leave quite enough seam allowance for my 1/2 inch bone to also have double thickness. And I would really like, if I'm gonna go back and redo it anyway, I would really like to have cut enough extra fabric so that when this extra is folded under, not only will I have 4 layers of fabric for my grommets, I will also have 4 layers of fabric for my boning channel, and that will kind of help protect that thick bone from poking a hole in the fabric as this is moving around. So I'm going to take advantage of my little error to kind of go in and tweak my pattern piece a little bit. Yeah, let's go do it. So the back panel was recut, this time with an even larger seam allowance. all the cording and boning channels were stitched, the side back panel was attached, and then I installed the grommets.
And don't worry about these panels going to waste. I will be repurposing them as lacing strips for future mock-ups. With one half of the corset finished, it was time to repeat the same process on the other half, the only difference being the button panel at the center front. This half needs to hold the buttons as well as one 12mm bone. The bone will sit in its own panel, with 2 layers of fabric on each side to make it extra sturdy. Then the buttons would be attached so that the cord they were on would be secured in the welt seam of the next panel. First, I carefully measured each button's placement using the buttonhole strip from the first side. Then I removed the buttons from my mock-up and aligned them on the new strip. A look at the original garment shows that the buttons should overlap halfway onto the boning strip, and so I imitated that placement on my corset, using tape to hold the buttons and their cords in the proper place while I stitched them down. An unorthodox method, perhaps, but unless you can show me a better one, I'm sticking to it. I then stitched over the cords several times each to make sure they were firmly held in place. The last thing I want is to pop a button and to try to figure out how to do a surgical operation to replace it. This panel was then rather awkwardly ironed flat, trying not to disturb the buttons too much, and then the center front was buttoned up for a quick test fit to make sure everything was properly aligned before I encased the seam allowance for good. Then the second half was assembled the same as the first half, and it was time to move on to the shoulder straps. These were cut out using the pattern for my mock-up, which is 2 pieces, the actual strap as well as a sort of elbow joint that connects the strap to the body. This could have been done as 1 piece, but I did it as 2 in order to imitate the extant corset. I suspect that this was originally done because it was a more efficient cutting method when mass producing these garments. The order of operations here got a little wonky because in order to fit the shoulder straps perfectly, I had to try the corset on, but in order for the fitting to be accurate, I need the bones inserted. So I had to bind most of the corset, but not the shoulder part, and things got a bit messy, so there's not so much footage of this part. The binding on the original is about 5mm wide and cut on the bias, which surprised me because nothing was cut on the bias back then because it wasted so much fabric. But this binding has to go around several tight curves, so I guess it makes sense. I cut out binding that was 2 centimeters wide, which, for the record, is not wide enough. I didn't discover this until I'd already cut out all of my binding, and I didn't want to waste it, so I made it work. But it was a pain in the butt, and I recommend instead doing a small test piece to check the width of your binding before committing to cutting out the entire length. Rookie mistake. First I cut my bones to length, then I carefully sanded the edges round, first with a rough grit and then with a finer grit for a smooth finish. Then the boning was inserted into their channels. With the binding all cut, I carefully pinned it down to the edges of the corset, right sides together, stitched it on, then wrapped the binding around the back of the corset and stitched it by hand. For those of you that just shuddered involuntarily at the thought of all of that hand stitching, rejoice, because the original waist was all done by machine, so that would actually be the more historically accurate method. But, as we discussed, I did a whoops, and had to do it all by hand, which I'm secretly okay with because I actually love hand stitching. With the bones in and the binding on, I then realized I forgot to insert the buttons that attach the shoulder straps, so these stitches were picked and the buttons carefully inserted. To make the attachment portion of the shoulder strap, I took the fabric I had cut out and divided it into 2 sections hot dog way. I then stitched down both of these sections, cut them apart, and turned them right side out. I then attached them to the other part of the shoulder strap using the same double welt seam method. The elbow joints were welt seamed onto the body of the corset, then the shoulder straps were pinned onto those joints at what I thought was a good length. Then those little cross pieces were added by folding a piece of twill to 3 layers thick and cutting it down into little sections that were added in 3 centimeter intervals along the tip of the strap. These strips were then basted in place to make sure that everything stayed neatly and cleanly in place while I sewed them on the machine. This method allowed the strap on these mass-produced garments to be adjustable into different lengths for different people. Although since I made this corset to my specifications, I will probably only be using one of the settings. This is where the messy filming process occurred, and I have no footage of it, but it was basically me trying on the corset, seeing where the shoulder straps sat, adjusting their length, trying it back on, readjusting, etc.
Once I had the final length set, I could sit down for one last session of hand stitching, this time involving the tricky tight corners of the end of the shoulder strap. Again, if you cut your bias binding wider than I did, your life will be much easier at this point.
And now I am finally done binding this whole thing. But before I go and try it on for the final reveal, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining me on this adventure. It means so much to me to have you all here, and I really love reading your comments and insights. A few thoughts. First of all, I am beyond thrilled with how this turned out. This corset marks my first real historical garment. I made my 1890s bicycle bloomers, but those can essentially pass as normal trousers, and I had made a corset before, but it wasn't exactly historical. So for me, this is my first tentative dip into the historical costuming pool, and I couldn't be happier with the results. As for the process, it was more or less smooth sailing, thanks to the mock-ups I made, although there were certainly some hiccups along the way. My cording is not as neat and tiny as I'd like it to be, and that mostly comes down to the foot I was using. I had several issues getting my machine to sew a cording channel immediately next to the chunky welt seam, so some of those channels came out a bit wider than I'd like, and a zipper foot or a cording foot would probably have helped greatly. Nevertheless, it's really only something you can see if you look super up close, so if we could all just squint a little during the reveal shots, that'd be great. There were a couple other silly mistakes along the way, like cutting my binding too narrow, or forgetting to put in the buttons for the shoulder straps before stitching the binding on, but these were all minor issues that just required a bit more patience and time. If you enjoyed this process, or if you learned something new, please consider subscribing for more historical costuming content with a side of corgi. My goal is to hit 1,000 of you lovely beans and to be able to get the elusive community tab. And, at the behest of a few of you lovely and generous viewers, I have set up a Ko-fi account if you would like to contribute. I absolutely don't expect it, but for those of you that would like to contribute to, say, a zipper foot, or perhaps a bone for canal, the link is down in the description, and I am grateful for anything you want to give, even if it's just some kind words in the comment section below. I certainly hope that you stick with me to the end of this series. Yes, this is a series, and there will be a link in the description. When I, a professional athlete and performer, put this corset to the test by wearing it as I run through some of my show routines. Without a live audience, of course. And now, let me go get changed and give you the grand reveal. Boing, 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 boing. Don't make me look small! Canal's judging me.
It's okay.